So, who is your hero? Everyone is a hero. Do you have a hero from history? I have a few. One of mine is Harry Truman, so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about him. Harry Truman was the last president to lack a college degree, much like other presidents I like, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. He came from nothing, grew up with nothing, was uneducated, but he was inquisitive, a voracious reader, and just a remarkable person. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. One of the things that I've been fortunate to do in my career is I've gotten a chance to meet a number of people that worked for my hero, people that worked for Harry Truman. It's called an oral history interview. I gathered together all the living former aides to Harry Truman, speechwriters, lawyers, even secretaries, and I interviewed them all for the Truman Presidential Library and the Truman Little White House. And I want to share a couple of stories with you. So first off, Truman was born in 1884, rural Missouri. His family was descended from slave owners. You could say they were unreconstructed Confederates. He had a very sheltered upbringing, worked as a farmer, worked as a railroad timer, worked briefly as a bank teller, liked that job, but then his dad had health issues, needed to go back and work on the farm. Truman longed to go to West Point, wanted to be a military officer or an architect or an historian. Gotta like him for that. What happened though was when World War I broke, he never went to college, obviously. When World War I broke out, Truman wanted to be an officer in the military. The problem is you have to pass an eye exam. And Truman was almost blind. He couldn't see at all. In fact, when he went to the war, he put extra glasses in all of his pockets in case of something happened to his glasses. So he has to pass the eye exam. So he's standing in line behind two other soldiers. He lets them go first. What he does is Truman, much like Lincoln and a few others, had a photographic memory. So Truman lets the other guys go first. He just listened and memorized the entire eye chart. So he walked in and said, I could barely see the wall. And he just gave the eye chart, so he got into the military. At any rate, so I put together a list of 10 fun stories that Truman's advisors and people at the Truman Presidential Library have all told me, or letters I've read about Truman. The first one is this. This man was as unaffected by success in the presidency. He was unaffected from the day of his death all the way back to the time he was a kid, completely unchanged. And here's a good example of it. So there were a group of secretaries outside of Truman's office. One of them named Wanda had told me this. I found her living over in Sarasota, and she baked me a cake. So Wanda told me that one day Truman walks by her desk, and she has a photograph sitting on the desk of her son. Let's say his name's John. And Truman stops and looks at it and says, Wanda, what's that picture on your desk? She said, first off, I couldn't believe the guy knew my name. Why would the president know one of many secretaries' names? She said, oh, that's my son. He said, well, what's his name? John. He said, well, how old is John? She said, he's 8. Well, he's not 8. He'll be 8 in another 3.5 months on such and such a date. You know where I'm going with this. 3.5 months later, Truman comes walking by her office. And as he walks to go into his office, he stops and turns around and says, Wanda, today is John's birthday. And she said, I almost fell out of my chair. He says, tell him that Harry said happy birthday. And then he walked into his office laughing. Gotta like that guy. Second story. A man wrote, and he said that his car broke down not far from Truman's home. Truman lived at 219 North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. So the man's car broke down. Of course, this is 1950s. There's no cell phone. There's no nothing. So the man goes and he knocks on Truman's door and asks if he could use his phone to make a call to call a tow truck. Truman says, sure. The man has no idea who Truman is. Truman lets him use the phone. Then Truman says, look, it'll be a few minutes until the tow truck gets here. Why don't you have a glass of iced tea? So they sit and they shoot the breeze. When the man leaves, he's walking down the steps. Truman walks out onto the front porch and is waving goodbye. And as the man's leaving, he turns around and looks at Truman and says, did anyone ever tell you, you look a lot like that SOB Harry Truman? And Truman says, yeah, I get that all the time. Bye-bye. The man later realizes that it was Harry Truman. And he said, I felt horrible about it. So that's when he wrote the letter to, I'm sitting here in my son's room. Alexander's my producer for this. Thank you, Alexander. So, a name for Hamilton, by the way. So, so the man felt bad and wrote the letter into Truman, but the typical Harry Truman. Here's a third one. This is cute. Um, Honeymooners were doing a cross country drive, one of these sort of Route 66 drives across Americana. And they stopped at Truman's home. Now, this is hard for us to imagine today where the president has such security and is inaccessible to almost everyone. They walked up to Truman's home. This is after his presidency. Nothing, no guards, nothing. They walked right up the front driveway. The woman went and stood on his porch, and the husband's going to take a photograph. Students, we used to not have cell phones. We had actual things called a camera. So the guy was going to take a photo. The woman writes, and she says, to her horror, the door opens up and Harry Truman's standing there. They thought they were in such trouble, but Truman laughs and says to them, "Come on, give me the camera, give me the camera." And he has them go up and sit on his porch, sit on the swing at the front door, and he's there taking photographs of them. They said they couldn't believe it. When they left, he walks out in the driveway and bye-bye, just as common as ever. And they said they were so excited about it. The only bad thing is when they got the photographs developed, Truman was a horrendous photographer. He cuts their heads off on almost all the pictures. Fourth story, and this is very timely for us today. In 2010, we had something called the Citizens United versus the FEC, that's the Federal Elections Commission, court case. It was a travesty. Shame, shame, shame on the members of the court that voted for this. This allows for an unlimited amount of unregulated dark money to be poured into our system. So no one, if you're a Democrat, you don't want the Koch brother pouring all this money. And if you're a Republican, you don't want George Soros pouring in all this money, millions and millions of dollars, corrupting the system. So here's Truman's view on it. In 1948, he's up for election. And Truman has there's a fundraiser, and he can get about $5,000 for it. Today, politicians wouldn't even show up for $5,000, but 1948, that's real money. Truman won't go. His aides are really, really frustrated. And they're telling him, "Mr. President, you've got to go. You don't understand. You're going to lose. In fact, you're going to probably bring down the Democratic Party with you. You've got to go." Truman doesn't want to go. He's too busy governing. Finally, they say, "Look, Mr. President, you don't understand." And he looks at them and he says, "No, you don't understand." He said, "It's not $5,000. If I win, it's 5,000 IOUs, and I'm not for sale." And he didn't go, and he still won that campaign. So that's the kind of moral leadership and integrity in office we need today. Fifth story, 1948, staying with that campaign. So Truman has a campaign train called a Ferdinand Magellan, and air travel is not what it was then, back what it is today. So Truman travels across the country on the train and goes to every little town, waving, talking from the back of the town, meeting farmers. Now imagine it's 1948 and no one had met a president. And Truman comes to your little town, population 125, and talks to you. What a powerful impact he had. He put enough miles on that train to go to the moon and back. So Truman's traveling around the country, and he's no great gifted orator like a Franklin Roosevelt or a Kennedy. He's rather common, doesn't have a good speaking voice, but here's what he does. He talks to people in a language they understand. Truman oftentimes tells people, he says, "Listen, you're not going to like what I'm about to tell you, but I ask that you don't boo me. Wait till the end before you boo me. Hear me out first. I promise what I'm giving you is not what some poll told me to say. It's from the heart." And then what he would do is he would tell them, "Look, I know the growing season has been tough. I know you're all struggling. I was a farmer. I get it. I understand." And then what he would do is I interviewed two of Truman's former speechwriters who told me that he would send them to all these little towns across the country in advance of his visit. And he would tell them to look things up. They had to find out what was the local high school football team's record that fall. Every town has a statue in the downtown of a Civil War soldier, Revolutionary War soldier, World War II soldier. Who's the soldier, statue, and what's his story? And number three, what's the main crop in the town? Now, Truman has a photographic memory. So what he does is when he's in these towns, he'll say something like, "If you vote for me, I'm going to give them hell the same way your local football team did last week when you beat Thomas Jefferson High 14-7. And boy, what a catch that receiver Jimmy Smith had at the end of the game. And people were thinking, how on earth does this guy know about our local football team? He'd also tell them, look, I know it's been tough, your cabbage harvest, your corn harvest, whatever. You're only getting X number of dollars per bushel. You should be getting a lot more. I get it. I'm going to work and do the best I can. You have my word as another farmer. Then he'd end up by telling them about the statue of the soldier in the downtown. He would remind them that he was a World War I hero. And Truman was not a general that rose way up high, so he wasn't in the field. He was a captain. So he was leading men, captain of Battery D, the Missouri Artillery. He was leading men in battle. He had killed people. He saw people die, had people die around him. So Truman would remind them that he served. And he would then tell them, I know the story of that young man that's on the statue, and he paid the ultimate price. I will honor his sacrifice. You have my word as a veteran. Now, how do you not like that guy? So that's the kind of speech he would give. One of his speechwriters was Dr. Ken Heckler, Hechler. He was a professor from Princeton, Columbia, and worked for FDR and Truman. Dr. Heckler told me that what he would do is Harry loved it when the audience would yell, "Give him hell, Harry." And that was his signature thing. And he would always say, I am. Or he'd say, I'm not giving him hell. I'm just telling the truth. And the Republicans think I'm giving him hell. So he loved that kind of salty stuff. So Dr. Heckler sneaks out into the audience with 100 people or whatever gathered. And he would start yelling, "Give him hell, Harry. Give him hell, Harry." He said, however, at one speech, he goes to do that. And there's a couple reporters standing next to him. And the reporters look at him and they say, wait a minute, weren't you that guy from the last couple of stops that was yelling, "Give him hell"? So I said to Dr. Heckler, what'd you do? You were nabbed. He said, I ducked and ran. And he ran through Dr. Heckler ran through the audience and then went up in the train. And Harry and his wife Bess and his daughter Margaret are sitting in their train cars. They're driving to the next stop. So Dr. Heckler knocked on the door and said, I got to tell you the story that he almost got caught. And he said the Truman family laughed and said, we must be the only campaign that brings along our own heckler. Number 6. Even though Truman was the last president to lack a college degree, he was a voracious reader. And he knew that the lessons of history were important lessons. So one of his aides told me that he was sent in to see President Truman, before an important radio address. And the key was the president was supposed to practice his radio address. So he walks in to see the president, knocks on the door. President says, come in. Truman's sitting there at his desk reading this giant, thick book. And the aide says, Mr. President, with all due respect, we have to practice your radio speech. And Truman says, that's just a speech on the radio now. This is history and leadership. And he holds up this thick volume of Charlemagne. And the aide said that Truman proceeded to give him a history of Europe from a Charlemagnean perspective that was beyond what any professor at Harvard could give. So that's where this failed farmer and rural haberdasher from Missouri learned a lot of his lessons from great works and leaders like Charlemagne. Number 7, Truman could be crusty as hell too. An aide told me that he was called once to come see Truman. And the secretary said, pronto, run. So the aide runs down and he runs up to the secretary and he sees there's this, sofa sitting there outside the president's office with all these very distinguished men wearing 3-piece suits. And the aide says to the secretary, look, whatever the president wants with me can't be that important. These men over here, they look really important. And the secretary said, no, the president was crystal clear. He wants to see you now. So the aide walks in and says, Mr. President, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's all these very distinguished looking men who are very angry. And the president said, yeah, have a seat. Let me tell you about those very distinguished men. He said, that's the board of Chase Bank. And he said, during World War II, when I was in the Senate, they were gold plating. That is, they were overcharging the Pentagon. They were making money off the war. And Truman used to always say, as bad as politics is, he said, you can almost forgive every political crime because it's so horrible. He said, however, there is one-way ticket to hell, and that is wartime profiteering. If you are making money while our men and women in uniform are dying. That's a one-way ticket to hell. So Truman was quite livid about that incident. By the way, I asked all these aides to tell me, when I interviewed them all, tell me Truman's favorite joke. This is his favorite joke. He used to always say that politics is so nasty. He said that it's the worst people. You can almost forgive everything because it's so bad. But his favorite joke was he would say, quote unquote, "Don't tell my mother I'm in politics. She thinks I play the piano in a whorehouse." This is what he used to say. At any rate, so the aide says, "Mr. President, all these distinguished men are out there." Truman says, "No, let me tell you, that's the board of Chase Bank. They were overcharging the government. And when I was the head of the Truman Committee, and I went up to see those guys and tell them, enough is enough. You can't, our men and women in uniform are dying." He said, "Those SOBs made me wait 1 hour. A U.S. senator who's coming to investigate this made me wait 1 hour." So he says, "The reason I've called you here today," to the aide, he goes, "have a seat and get comfortable, because those SOBs have another 50 minutes to sit and stew." He made them wait 1 hour and 1 minute. Then he told the aide, "You might like this." And when he called him in, he told them why he made them wait 1 hour. Number 8. One of the most revered Americans during the time was General Douglas MacArthur. Graduated top of his class from West Point. He looked like he was straight out of Central Casting. MacArthur would pose for a lot of his pictures. At any rate, MacArthur, Truman knew, was a stuffed, shirt and a peacock. But I think one of the most overrated Americans in history, quite frankly. But so here's the problem. In the Korean War, MacArthur violates direct orders from his commander-in-chief, the president. You don't do that. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, these are the heads of each military service, they issue MacArthur orders to stand down. He violates that. They tell MacArthur, don't go above the parallel that separates North and South Korea. MacArthur rushes above it. They say, don't go to Pyongyang, the capital up in North Korea. He goes above it. They say, don't go all the way to the Yalu River. That's the river that separates mainland China from North Korea. He goes to the Yalu River. Why was he told not to go there? Because we're going to bring the Chinese into the war if you go there. And MacArthur's army is wiped out after a brilliant landing at Incheon, in southern part of the peninsula. It's wiped out by the Chinese who entered the fight. They pushed MacArthur all the way back down the peninsula. Truman and the Joint Chiefs tell him to zip it, stay put. MacArthur starts mouthing off to the press and bad-mouthing the president. Then he asks for battlefield tactical control of our atomic weapons. That's madness. There's no way they're going to give a general that control in the field. MacArthur won't zip it. So Truman goes to meet MacArthur at Wake Island. MacArthur won't go back to see Truman. Truman goes to meet him. MacArthur meets Truman, and he's not wearing his tie. He's not wearing his dress uniform. You're meeting with the commander-in-chief during war. You dress up. MacArthur completely disrespects Truman, so Truman says, that's it, I've got to fire him. Truman's aides beg him, don't fire MacArthur. MacArthur's way more popular than you. You're going to lose on this. Truman says, nope, I don't care, got to fire him. The aides say, let the Joint Chiefs of Staff fire him. Truman says, I would never give to a man in uniform something to do that I wouldn't be willing to do myself. They said, well, have the Joint Chiefs stand behind you when you fire him. He said, unlike politicians today, he said, I would never use a man in uniform as a prop. Truman says, I'm firing him. Well, this aide tells me that the president calls him into his office and says, I have something for you to do. It's about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He says, I need you to go to the Library of Congress. I need you to look up all the books you can find on how Abraham Lincoln fired General McClellan, George McClellan, during the Civil War. And then Truman starts ticking off the names of all the great books to get. And the aide's thinking, oh my God, I can't believe the president knows all this stuff. So the aide goes to the Library of Congress, gets all the books out, sitting upstairs in the Library of Congress, working on it. This would never happen today with alarm systems and security. The aide said when the Library of Congress was closing at night, he wasn't done. So what he did was he stole the books and ran out the door. Today, you could never do that. He had asked the president, when do you need this report on how Lincoln fired General McClellan, who needed to be fired, by the way, one of the most overrated people in American history. And Truman said, 0500. That's 5 a.m. the next morning. So the aide, stays up all night preparing this report. He goes and gives Truman the report and says, now, why do you want to report on how Lincoln fired General McClellan? And this is what Truman says when he announces the firing of MacArthur. He said, General McClellan disobeyed direct orders from Lincoln, disrespected him. He thought Lincoln was a Midwestern clod who lacked military experience. He, McClellan, thought he should be running the war because he, McClellan, wanted to be the next president and beat Lincoln. He said, but Lincoln fired him because he knew McClellan was a stuffed peacock. So Truman says, ladies and gentlemen, I'm announcing the firing of General MacArthur. MacArthur thinks his president, me, is a Midwestern clod who lacks military experience. He thinks he ought to be running the war because he wants to be the next president when all he is a stuffed peacock. So Truman put his finger on the perfect historical analogy in the firing of MacArthur. By the way, after MacArthur was fired, he got probably the largest ticker tape parade in the history of New York City, and Truman's approval numbers went down to historic lows. The Republicans wanted to nominate MacArthur for president. They invited him to speak in Congress, and MacArthur gave one of the most popular speeches in the history of Congress. Personally, I think it was baloney. It was a terrible speech. And he has this line, "Old generals never fade away." What is that? He gives this line, Republicans were crying in the Congress. They were so excited about this. So the press couldn't resist jabbing Truman. You fired MacArthur. All that's going to do is make him president now. So the Democrats were panicked. The Republicans were crying. So the press goes to see Truman and says, what do you think about this? And Truman says, yeah, well, I heard there wasn't a dry eye among the Republicans or a dry seat among the Democrats. He says, but I don't worry. MacArthur's a peacock. I'll beat him. And MacArthur didn't run, and Truman got reelected. Number 9, one of Truman's close confidants would end up being the great Winston Churchill. So unbeknownst to Truman, Churchill was worried that Truman was not an FDR. This is this uneducated farmer. He's not up to leading the world. So Churchill wants to meet with Truman and talk some sense into him. Unbeknownst to Churchill, Truman wants to meet with Churchill because Truman recognizes he, Harry, is no FDR or no Churchill. He needs someone of Churchill's gravitas behind him to enact these policies. So Truman invites Churchill to come and see him, and he arranges in March of 1946 for Churchill to speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. So Churchill and Truman board Truman's train, the Ferdinand Magellan. And Truman and Churchill both like to drink. They both like to talk, and they both like to play cards. So they're both nervous. They don't really know one another. So Truman and his aides sit down with MacArthur, and boy, do they start drinking. And they just drink and drink and drink. General Vaughn, the military aide, wrote this down. You know, by midnight, these two are completely pickled. They've been drinking so much the whole car reeks. So Churchill, and they're playing poker. Churchill gets up to go to the bathroom. And even though Truman's licked, when Churchill gets up and walks out, the aide said that all of a sudden Truman became dead serious. And he says, listen, the prime minister is down several $100s. I want him going to bed tonight with money in his pocket. The future of the free world depends on it. So he told the aides, any one of you that wins another hand, you're fired. So they get extra cards, and they're slipping Churchill cards. Churchill's so drunk he doesn't even realize. He ends up a couple $100. So in the middle of the night, Truman calls the game. All the aides leave, but Truman and Churchill sit up the rest of the night, pickled. And they are talking, and this is where they plan NATO. They plan the response to the Soviet Union. They plan the post-war order. They do all this stuff on this train car, completely pickled. And the next morning, Truman puts his academic regalia on, and they go into Westminster College. And the aides said that the two of them were still completely drunk. They were like laughing and leaning on one another. They said when they walked up to the front stage where the provost and president of the university are, it just reeked of alcohol. Churchill gets up and gives one of the greatest and most important speeches in world history. This is his famous Iron Curtain speech to warn about the Soviet Union. What a great story. Last good story for you. I asked all the aides that worked for Truman, when you first met him, what did you think? What was your first impression? What did he say to you? And they said, when we met FDR, we felt like saluting and saying, Your Majesty, because he was just so charismatic. When we met Truman, we felt like saying, hello, Harry, because he was just so common. Common man, uncommon leader. Ordinary man, extraordinary leader. So this is what they said. When you went to work for Truman, he insisted on meeting everyone that worked for him. And this is what he'd say to them. He'd say, I want you to know something. The rich and powerful people, they all have lawyers. All the big corporations, they have lobbyists. All the rich and this and that, they all have aides. But the regular people, all they have, you and me. And as long as you work for me, you had better never forget that. Are we clear? And they would say, yes, sir. And they'd say, welcome to the team. I want to work for someone like that. Isn't that great? So I thought I'd close by simply saying, give you a couple of leadership tips. So this is an uneducated president, although well-read, inquisitive, who lacked a college degree, but makes some of the most important decisions in world history. You know, when you look at the great ones, your FDR, your Lincoln, your George Washington, no question about it, some of the greatest leaders in world history. If you look at them, each one of them has, Lincoln has probably 5, 6, 7 big ticket items, and he gets them right. Most presidents are lucky if they get maybe 1 or 2 big decisions, and maybe they get 1 out of the 2 right. Some presidents, George W. Bush, get all of them wrong. But Truman has probably 15 major decisions, more than any other president. 15 for 15. Gets them all right. The Berlin airlift, which saves us from World War III. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilds Western civilization. NATO, the Transatlantic Alliance, promotes civil rights, Executive Order 9981, years before Kennedy would pass the Civil Rights Bill. The Truman Doctrine, which leads the West against the Soviet Union for decades. Every single president of both political parties, Eisenhower all the way through to Obama, follows Truman's lead to the letter of the law, except Trump. Trump says it's a joke and they're laughing at us and tears it up. It was good enough for every other world leader and every other president and every other Congress. So this is all designed by a failed haberdasher. So here's just a handful. I wrote down 4 because we could be here all day. I want to keep it to a half hour. Here's 4 leadership tips that you can take in your life, no matter what you do after finishing school, no matter what you do. Here's some good leadership tips. Number 1, Truman immersed himself in every topic. He read and read and read. When he had to make a decision on the Marshall Plan, which saves Western civilization, he went back and read everything he could about how Lincoln designed Reconstruction, which brought the South back into the fold and healed the country in the bitter years after the Civil War. So Truman immersed himself in books and reading and history. He had a saying he would always tell people. He'd say, quote unquote, the only new thing in the world is the history that you haven't read. So in other words, all the answers are there in history and great books. Number 2 leadership trait. If you disagreed with Truman, he wouldn't fire you. President Trump has made a living off of firing everybody around him, suing everyone, and destroying most every business or everything he touches. Other presidents, Democrats like Lyndon Johnson, Republicans like Richard Nixon, were so thin-skinned, if you disagreed with them, they would mix up the messenger with the message, no matter what you said, and you were fired. They demanded loyalty, which is problematic. Truman did not fire you if you disagreed with him. He got rid of you if you did not disagree with him. Truman knew that debate and dissent and disagreement were the linchpins of democracy, that a constitutional democracy like ours doesn't work without free speech, without debate and dissent. That's something we sure could use today. Number 3, I interviewed several of Truman's aides who would tell me, I said, walk me through the process when he would develop a speech, or he would design a policy, when he would sign a bill, sign a treaty, sign off on a speech. And they would say he would demand that everybody debate with him, disagree with him. They went around the room, everybody have at this, I need to hear what's wrong with it. Everybody had to say what was wrong with it. At the end, okay, then now we've debated it. He said, I'm going to go sleep on this tonight, think about it, then I'm going to come down in the morning and we're going to sign off on it. So he didn't rush it. And before he signed off, he would always say, okay, now tell me, is this the right thing to do? And in the end analysis, any treaty, any bill, any speech, in the end analysis, if it had to pass his test, is this simply, morally, the right thing to do? And the last tip I'm going to give you is Truman, and today, my gosh, we have multiple political polls a day. Truman was not beholden to polls. Damn the polls. Truman would do what was right, irrespective of the polls. He would rather do what was right and lose than do what was wrong and win. And you just don't find that. One example, 1948 Democratic Convention. His own party doesn't even want to renominate him. Truman is promoting a civil rights program, a program for the fledgling state of Israel, women's issues. And all this is going to cost him the election because Truman needs to not only win, but sweep the South. And yet he's pushing all these issues. When he announces his platform, Strom Thurmond, who was the racist former governor and senator from South Carolina, he walks out because of Truman's program for Israel, for women, for civil rights. He walks out taking Southern delegates. They walk out of the convention. And as he's walking out, a reporter stops Thurmond and says, "Why are you walking out?" He said, "Because of Truman's support for," and he ticks off all these issues. The reporter says, "Yeah, but FDR used to always say the same thing." And Thurmond says, "Yeah, here's the difference. We all knew FDR only talked about it, but Truman means it." And he walked out. That night, Truman puts pen to paper and writes in a diary. He writes that in doing these things, I will lose the election. So be it. It's the right thing to do. So I always encourage you, before you make an important decision in your personal life or your careers, what would Harry do? Always think, is this the right thing to do? Thank you.